Imagine you're the richest man in the ancient world. You have more gold than some nations. You've conquered peoples and built palaces. You summon one of the wisest men alive, a Greek sage, and ask him a simple question. Who is the happiest person you've ever seen? You're expecting him to say you. Instead, he names a man you've never heard of, an ordinary citizen of Athens, a man named Tellus, who owned no great fortune and ruled no kingdom. And the reason this sage gives for choosing Tellus will reshape how you think about what it means to live a good life. To understand why the sage Solon gave that answer, you have to understand the most radical political invention in human history, something that emerged not from a palace, not from a king's decree, but from a 10-acre farm in the Greek countryside. This is the story of the Polis, right? Where Egypt and Persia were monolithic empires ruled by god kings. Greece was shattered into hundreds of tiny independent communities, each one governing itself. City-states existed elsewhere in the ancient world. Mesopotamia had them, Phoenicia had them. The Greek polis, their word for city-state, was distinguished not by its structure, but by the Greeks' conception of its purpose. The polis was understood as the sole arena in which justice could exist and the only community in which a person could lead a good life. This idea appears remarkably early in Greek civilization and never disappears. The Greeks believed your individual happiness was inseparable from the well-being of your community. A rich man in a failing city was not a happy man. The polis wasn't just where you lived, it was the only place where you could become fully human. And the polis created something that had never existed before in human history, the citizen. The Greek word is polites, derived directly from polis. Before the polis, there were no citizens anywhere in the world. There were only subjects, people subject to a god, a king, a pharaoh, a divine representative. Someone, in a sense, owned them. A subject existed at the pleasure of a ruler. A citizen belongs to the community, and the community belongs to the citizen. Nobody owns a citizen. This was entirely new, and it carried obligations in both directions. The community owed the citizen justice and protection. The citizen owed the community loyalty, service, and if necessary, his life. That reciprocal bond is the foundation of everything that follows. To see this worldview taking shape, we start around 700 BC with a poet who got cheated by his own brother. Hesiod lived in a small town in Boeotia, a region north of Athens. He was not a king or a philosopher. He was a working farmer with a grievance. In his poem Works and Days, Hesiod tells how his brother Pericles bribed the local basileis, the chiefs who served as judges in these small communities, and stole Hesiod's rightful share of their father's inheritance. This personal injustice drove Hesiod to address a much larger question, the nature of justice itself and its proper home. To make his argument about justice, Hesiod tells the fable of the hawk and the nightingale. A hawk seizes a nightingale in its talons. The nightingale cries out in pain. The hawk replies, "He is a fool who tries to match his strength with the stronger. He will lose the battle and with the shame will be hurt also." This is the doctrine of might over right. Raw power determines who wins. But Hesiod rejects this doctrine. He argues there is a better path, the path of justice. And justice, for Hesiod, has a specific home. She lives in the polis. Hesiod personifies justice as the goddess Dike, the Greek word for justice. When Dike is outraged, she comes weeping before the people to the polis and its gatherings, bringing a dark mist and a curse upon all who drive her out. Then Hesiod draws a sharp contrast between two kinds of communities. In the just polis, where men give fair decisions to strangers and natives alike, the city flourishes. Peace reigns. Zeus keeps them free of wars. Their flocks thrive. Their wives bear children. Their land is so fruitful they need not risk dangerous sea voyages. The Greeks harbored genuine fear of the sea. Despite becoming active seafaring people, A just city is so blessed its people never face that danger. The unjust polis suffers the opposite fate. Those who practice violence and cruelty bring Zeus's severe punishments: plague, famine, barren women, destroyed armies, wrecked cities, lost ships, and here is the most striking claim: an entire polis may be ruined for the sake of one bad man. One person's corruption can bring down the whole community. Three conclusions follow from Hesiod. First, the polis already exists as a recognized institution by roughly 700 BC. Second, justice is inextricably linked to the polis. It is the only place where justice can exist. Third, individual behavior affects the entire community. No one is merely a private person. That third point marks a dramatic departure from the heroic values of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. In Homer, Achilles, the greatest warrior alive, refuses to fight for his community because of a personal insult. Thousands of his countrymen die because one man's pride was wounded. In Hesiod's world, that would be inconceivable. The community's welfare takes priority over any individual's honor. The poet Tyrtaeus of Sparta captured this ethic in poems so central to Spartan life they became marching songs for the army. This communal ideal raises a tension that persisted throughout Greek history: how to reconcile the interests of the individual and family with those of the community. Your family needs you alive. Your city may need you dead on the battlefield. For the Greeks, the answer was clear. One ought to act on behalf of the polis. To argue otherwise would have been eccentric and disreputable. Now we can understand the full weight of the story introduced at the beginning. Croesus was the fabulously wealthy king of Lydia in Asia Minor, a man whose wealth was so legendary it gave us the phrase rich as Croesus. When Solon of Athens, one of the 7 sages of Greece, visited Lydia, Croesus gave him a grand tour of his treasure houses, displaying gold and silver beyond measure. Then he posed the question he was sure he knew the answer to: who is the happiest man you have ever seen? Solon named Tellus of Athens, a man unknown outside his own city. Croesus was incredulous. Solon's reasoning reveals the Greek value system in its purest form. First, Tellus's polis was flourishing. A man living in a polis that is not doing well cannot be happy, no matter how rich he is. The community's condition determines the individual's happiness. Second, he had sons who were kaloi kagatoi, literally beautiful and good, the Greek expression for a gentleman of the highest quality, fine in appearance and excellent in soul. These sons grew up and had children of their own, securing Tellus's family line. Third, after a life of comfort, Tellus died gloriously in battle at Eleusis, coming to the aid of his countrymen, routing the enemy, and falling on the field. The Athenians honored him with a public funeral on the spot where he fell, a distinction usually reserved for the highest citizens. This mattered so deeply because the Greeks did not believe in personal immortality as we understand it. The afterlife, a dark, shadowy existence in Hades, was nothing anyone looked forward to. Continuity through sons who carry forward the family name was one form of immortality. But the greatest form came from dying nobly in service to the polis. Such a death earned extraordinary public honors, and one's memory would endure as long as the polis endured, as Herodotus's own retelling of the story, centuries later, proves. This form of immortality was available only through one's place in the polis. Wealth could not buy it, only service could earn it. So far, this is the idea of the polis, what the Greeks believed it was for. But the polis didn't merely reflect values, it actively created them. Solon, the same sage who lectured Croesus, would later be appointed sole public official in Athens to draw up new constitutional laws. Before that appointment, he wrote political pamphlets in verse, because poetry was the standard form for public argument in early Greece, a powerful memory device in oral cultures where most people couldn't read. In one surviving fragment, Solon wrote, "The public ruin invades the house of each citizen, and the courtyard doors no longer have strength to keep it away, but it overleaps the lofty wall, and the lower man runs in and tries to hide in his chamber or closet. It ferrets him out. No private space is safe from public collapse." Solon contrasted two conditions, dysnomia, bad government, and eunomia, good government. Eunomia levels rough places, stops gluttony and greed, strips force from violence, dries up the flowers of despair, straightens crooked judgments, echoing Hesiod's own complaint about his brother, tempers swollen ambitions, ends divisional strife, stills the gall of hate, and makes all human life harmonious. These blessings come not from the gods, but from the polis itself, when its laws are good. This is the critical claim. A good polis following good laws does not merely prevent and punish wrongdoing, a negative restraining function. It actively shapes the character of its citizens, making them better people. The polis does not just defeat wrong, it creates right. Every Greek state, regardless of its particular constitution, made this claim. For a city to be good, its men must be good, and the city must make them so. This Greek conviction looks most alien beside our own political tradition. The American constitutional framework, built by James Madison and expressed in Federalist Number 10, operates on the opposite premise. Human nature cannot be improved by laws. People will always pursue factional interests. A good constitution balances competing desires against one another to approximate justice, not by making citizens better, but by making their selfishness cancel out. The American founding broke from the ancient idea that laws could make men virtuous, instead accepting human nature as given and designing institutions to manage it. The Greek idea placed enormous responsibility on the polis and demanded enormous devotion from its citizens. Madison said, "Manage self-interest." Solon said, "Transform the self." These two visions define the poles of political philosophy to this day. By the 5th century BC, this tension between individual and community found its most sophisticated expression. In the winter of 431 BC, the Athenian statesman Pericles delivered a funeral oration for the war dead, recorded by the historian Thucydides. Pericles made a radical argument. The individual's highest needs and greatest personal and family goals could be met only through the polis. Personal well-being was inextricably bound to community well-being, not as a sacrifice, but as an identity. They were the same thing. Aristotle, writing toward the end of the era of the free polis, likewise held that the polis was something necessary for mankind, the very center of human life. Without the polis, a person was either a beast or a god, not fully human. This conviction explains the Greeks' fierce devotion to the independence and autonomy of their individual polis and their desire to beautify and elevate them. But the idea of polis greatness had a darker side. Every polis wanted to be great, and the competitive Greek temperament, what they called agon, the drive to excel and defeat rivals, meant rivalry frequently led to conflict and war. The Greek world was filled with warfare throughout the entire history of the polis, to a greater degree than other civilizations of the ancient world. The reason was structural. No single power dominated the entire region. In Egypt, a unified great power eliminated the possibility of war between independent states, but also eliminated freedom. Persia's empire imposed peace across millions of square miles, but no one within it was free. In Greece, frequent war and widespread freedom were two sides of the same coin, both tied inseparably to the nature of the polis. Where there are many free communities, each proud and competitive, there will be war. So far, we've talked about the ideas of the polis, what the Greeks believed it was for, and what it demanded. But ideas don't appear from nowhere. They grow in soil, literally. Three interconnected developments shaped the emergence of the polis: how the Greeks made their living, how they fought, and how they governed themselves. All three are inseparable. The scholar Victor Davis Hanson, himself a fifth-generation farmer in California's Central Valley, working land in a climate remarkably similar to the Mediterranean, advanced a controversial but powerful thesis. The development of the polis can be understood through the lens of how farming was practiced. And that story begins with the catastrophic collapse of the most advanced civilization the Greek world had ever known. During the Mycenaean era, agriculture was collectivized, controlled from palace centers. The Mycenaeans possessed sophisticated knowledge of viticulture, olive processing, grafting, and hybridization, but all of it was centralized. Individuals had no autonomy over the land they worked. When the palace civilization collapsed around 1200 BC, the entire agricultural system collapsed with it. Centralized knowledge was lost. This explains the severe population decline, poverty, and starvation of the Greek Dark Ages, centuries of hardship. But the collapse also created an opening for something that had never existed before: freedom and independent growth. During the Dark Ages, large estates dominated, run by aristocrats surrounded by warrior bands focused on livestock, sheep, goats, and horses for aristocratic warfare. The oikos, the household, was the basic unit of production and survival. Homer's Odyssey shows us King Laertes, a nobleman and a former king, working the soil with his own hands, a figure poised between two worlds. Then came the transformative moment. Sometime during the Dark Ages, probably around the 8th century BC, the oikos obtained a defined parcel of land, the kleros, understood to belong to the family permanently. The family knew it possessed this land now, would possess it next year, and could pass it from father to son through inheritance. This stability changed everything. Secure tenure provided the basis for long-term investment. Previously, cultivators either rented land, worked as hired laborers, toiled as serfs, or labored as slaves. None had incentive to invest in improving crops or trees. Planting an olive tree that takes 15 years to mature makes no sense if someone can seize your land next season. Hanson calls the invention of the family farm the critical moment in its transformation, with no known parallel outside Greece at this period. As the family farm took hold, population grew, a fact strongly supported by archaeology. When the best bottomland was exhausted, farmers didn't stop. They moved to marginal lands through what Hanson calls internal colonization, clearing hillsides, terracing slopes, bringing less promising plots into production through relentless hard work. The knowledge of viticulture and the tree cultivation was gradually relearned from contact with Asia as Greece's isolation ended. These farms practiced intensive agriculture. Every piece of soil was put to use. Grain provided bread, the staple of life. Olives produced olive oil, used for cooking, cleaning, lighting, ritual, and even as currency. Vegetables grew where grain couldn't. Grapes, primarily for wine, the universal Greek drink, filled the remaining space. Together, these crops provided a nearly complete diet, supplemented by small amounts of meat, cheese, and milk. Despite being surrounded by water, the Greeks ate surprisingly little fish. Major schools simply didn't frequent Greek waters. Raw crops weren't enough. Grapes needed to become wine. Olives needed to become olive oil. Poor farmers who sent their produce to middlemen lost a significant share of profit. Successful family farmers acquired their own presses and storage ceramics, capturing more value from each harvest. This processing capacity made the difference between subsistence and modest prosperity. Farms were small, perhaps 10 acres on average, producing not an agricultural aristocracy, but a broad community of small, independent family farms. This was the material foundation of the polis, not great estates, not collectivized palace agriculture, but modest plots worked by free families who owned their land and kept what they grew. As the family farm developed, slavery grew alongside it. The key was crop diversity. A single crop farm left slaves idle for much of the year. But on the diversified family farm, different crops demanded labor in different seasons. Grain at one time, olives at another, grapes at another, creating year-round work. A typical farm might have one or two slaves. The reality bore no resemblance to plantation slavery in the Americas. With only one or two slaves, the master worked alongside them in the fields, ate with them, lived in the same house. They functionally resembled hired hands. The critical difference was legal status, and that difference was absolute. The paradox is stark. The same family farm that gave rise to a free, self-governing citizenry also fostered slavery. Freedom and slavery emerged together from the same soil. A new kind of farm produced a new kind of person, and a new kind of person demanded a new kind of government. Under the Mycenaean model, a king ruled and everyone was a subject, despotism in its simplest form. When the palaces fell, the Dark Age Basileus, the chief, was surrounded by noblemen who also claimed the title Basileis, power derived from wealth, strength, and noble birth. This was aristocratic society. A smaller deliberative body called the Bulle, the council, held real authority and made the important decisions. An assembly of adult males, the ecclesia, existed but was consulted mainly on questions of war. A fragmentary inscription from the island of Chios, possibly from the 8th century, contains a remarkable phrase, Bulle Hedemosia, the council for the people, the earliest known reference to such a body. The word demos, the people, signals something entirely new stirring in the political order. Hansen's central point. The successful farmer was not just a different kind of farmer, he was a different kind of person. A citizen in his political role, a soldier who participated in the decision to go to war, an active shaper of state policy. Independent in a way no one below the rank of king or aristocrat had ever been. The old aristocracy didn't vanish. A long period of tension played out. In some places, aristocracy held on. In others, discontented farmers rallied behind a distinguished aristocratic leader, typically a military commander, producing what the Greeks called tyranny. One-man rule ceased outside the law. Tyrannies lasted varying lengths, but once a tyrant was removed, one-man rule never returned in that city. It was permanently discredited. After tyranny came oligarchy, rule of the few, and here is the essential correction to a widespread misconception. Oligarchy, not democracy, was the most common form of government in Greek city-states throughout the classical period. Democracy was invented and it did spread, but democratic states were never the majority. The typical polis was governed by the farmer class and above, those who fought in the decisive infantry and made political decisions, while the poorer population was excluded. The family farm and its independent owners did not necessarily lead to democracy. Democracy was an unusual outcome. The more characteristic result was a broadened oligarchy rooted in the wealth and military service of the citizen farmer class. Crucially, this new oligarchy was based on wealth, not birth, and that shift was the revolution. From a small farmer in Boeotia complaining about crooked judges, to the invention of the kleros and the citizen farmer soldier, to Solon arguing that the polis creates justice, to Pericles claiming that the individual's highest fulfillment could come only through the community, the Greeks built something without precedent. The polis was a place where, for the first time in human history, people were not subjects but citizens, where the community was understood not as a mechanism of control, but as the only arena for justice and a good life, where laws didn't just restrain human behavior, they aspired to transform human character. That aspiration carried contradictions the Greeks never resolved. Freedom and slavery born from the same soil, independence and the war as two faces of the same coin. The individual's desire for glory and the community's demand for sacrifice locked in permanent tension. Now you understand why Solon named Tellus, not because Tellus was rich. Chrysos was rich beyond imagination, because Tellus lived in a way that only the Polis made possible. He lived in a flourishing city. He raised fine sons who were kaloi kagasoi, beautiful and good. He died nobly in its defense, and his memory endured because the Polis honored it, preserved it, and passed it down through the generations. Croesus, for all his gold, would lose his kingdom to the Persians and learn Solon's lesson the hardest way. We still haven't resolved the tensions the Greeks discovered on those small farms. Every time we debate whether government should shape the character of its citizens or simply manage their competing interests, whether a nation's well-being determines our own, whether service to the community is the highest form of citizenship, we are, whether we know it or not, having a conversation the Greeks started on 10-acre farms in rocky soil 27 centuries ago.